The movie begins with Elizabeth working in a hospital, checking on her patients. She is a successful and driven young emergency room physician who wants to stay in San Francisco to finish her medical residency. Her boss allows her to stay in this hospital for longer, which makes her happy, but he wants her to take proper care of herself. Elizabeth's work is all-encompassing, which leaves no time for her to do anything romantic. One night, she is going to her sister's house for a dinner party, who has fixed her up with a date over dinner. She is driving there in the rain. Elizabeth's car goes out of control into the path of a vehicle. Her car soon gets in an accident. The accident gets Elizabeth into a coma. David Abbott is a lonely and depressed landscape architect who is coping with some personal problems. After his wife's death, he requires a new beginning. He is looking for an apartment and meets with the house owner, who shows him the inside of the apartment, but he does not like it. He learns about the flat through a sublet while walking down the street. He discovers that the location is the same as what he is looking for, which looks to be a fortunate coincidence. He goes inside the residence with the owner. He makes the decision to rent it out. Elizabeth owns this apartment, but it has been vacant for some time. Shortly after moving in, he makes a mess in Elizabeth's very organized place. He watches movies and places all his drinks and food on the table. He spends all day and night on the couch. One day, he is shocked to see a woman yelling at him to get out of her apartment. Elizabeth believes he is a burglar looking for something to steal, but she informs him that there is nothing worth stealing. She also gives him the advice that she will give him money to go to a shelter nearby, which surprises David. She sees a mess on the table and becomes angry. She asks him to clean up the mess before leaving, but suddenly she disappears. David suspects she has broken in, so he replaces the door lock with a more secure one. Because David is the only one who can see or hear Elizabeth, he goes to his psychotherapist friend, Jack, and tells him everything. Jack believes he is hallucinating and is on the verge of alcoholism. Later that night, he again sees her in his bedroom. She yells at him for not leaving her apartment. She thinks he has fantasized that he rented this apartment, but in reality, this apartment belongs to her. She tries to convince him that he is mentally ill and that he should call the police. She tries to grab mobile, but her hand passes through it and she cannot hold it, which makes her furious, and she disappears. The next day, David calls the house lady, who informs him that the girl who lived in this apartment before David has died, which surprises him. He visits a bookstore to get some books on spirits. He calls her at the apartment, but she doesn't pick up. But suddenly she appeared when he was about to break her coffee mug. He asks her some questions about his life to find out why she is appearing at his apartment. She starts to appear only to David, which leaves both very confused. Elizabeth finds herself walking through items in the house, and they both come to realize there is something more going on. She rushes to hit him when she gets angry, but her hand slips through his face. She becomes concerned because she is walking through things, appearing and disappearing unintentionally, and has no memory of herself. He tries to convince her that she is a ghost, but she dismisses his claims. David wants her to leave his apartment, but she is not willing to leave. He stops talking to her, but she starts teasing him by showing up everywhere in the house. David invites his friend Daryl to his house, who works as a bookstore employee and is knowledgeable about the supernatural. David and Elizabeth argue in front of him, and he also tells David he has a blocked heart and needs to let go of the woman who was preliminarily in his life. When Elizabeth says he should get over being ditched, he storms out, and Daryl tells Elizabeth not to disrespect the dead. She finds David, and he speaks about his wife. He agrees to assist Elizabeth in finding her identity. Determined to help her, David asks her neighbors to find out about her, but they do not know her. He again argues with her because he is tired of helping her. They find the address of the dry cleaner in the cupboard and go to ask him about anything he knows about Elizabeth because she gave him pants for cleaning. But unfortunately, the man does not know anything about her. Elizabeth recognized a restaurant where she has always wanted to eat on her way home. They go inside but do not eat anything. They were about to leave when a man fell to the ground with some medical issues. Elizabeth walks David through saving his life. Realizing she is a doctor, they head to the nearest hospital, where things start to come back to Elizabeth. Dr. Fran, her mentor, takes David to Elizabeth, who is in a coma. When David touches her hand, Elizabeth feels it, meaning she is still connected to her body. She learns about everything, including the accident that got her into her current situation, a coma. David discovers more about Elizabeth's horrific accident and family as he digs deeper into her past. Elizabeth's sister Abby arrives, and Dr. Brett notifies Abby that Elizabeth signed a DNR order. He asks her to sign off on disconnecting life support, and she says she will consider it. Elizabeth goes to the apartment and informs David that her sister is going to sign papers which will take her off life support. He becomes worried for her. Angered, she climbs to the roof after learning that Katrina, a neighbor girl, is in David's bedroom. David goes to her and takes her to the beautiful garden which she says she had dreamed of. David had worked here and made this garden. They were talking about the garden, when David receives a call from the house owner who tells him that he has been offered a long-term lease. On asking about the reason, he finds out the hospital is going to take Elizabeth off from life support. David tries to prevent it by going to Abby's to tell her that Elizabeth is communicating with him. While there, her niece, Lily, can see Elizabeth. Abby refuses David's request to keep her alive because she has already signed the paperwork stating that life support will terminate the next day. As a last effort, David spills out Abby's secret from her wedding day. This freaks out Abby so much that she drives him out of her house. Elizabeth chooses to spend her final night in the apartment with David. The next morning, he is determined to prevent her death and he makes plans to steal her body from the hospital. He enlists his friend and therapist, Jack, to help him in carrying out this plan. While helping David, Jack recognizes Elizabeth. Turns out David can see Elizabeth because they were intended to meet. Jack tells David Elizabeth is Abby's younger sister who is his ex-college girlfriend. The two had arranged for them to go on a blind date the night of Elizabeth's accident. Elizabeth's spirit realizes why David is the only one who can see Elizabeth, because they were intended to meet. With the help of Jack and a few others, they successfully transport Elizabeth's comatose body to a beautifully landscaped garden that she had mentioned in her coma. He confesses his love for her to Jack and Elizabeth. She tells him she feels she's been there before. Security guards apprehend them while they attempt to steal Elizabeth's body. Her breathing tube falls off as they drag Jack away from her. Elizabeth starts dying, and David anxiously gives her kisses while her spirit starts to fade away. Suddenly, her heartbeat returns, and she wakes up from the coma. Elizabeth recognizes Abby, but surprisingly does not recognize David. David gets really upset and he leaves. Sometime later, Elizabeth moves back into her apartment. She is drawn to the roof, where she discovers David, who has turned it into a beautifully planted garden. He says that he had gotten using the spare key her spirit had shown him. When Elizabeth asks for her key back, their hands come into contact. Elizabeth begins to remember what happened while she was in a coma, and she joyfully kisses David. Elizabeth and David are finally together, having overcome the obstacles of life and death. Elizabeth returns to her medical profession, and David embraces his newfound happiness.